In this class we're going to talk about dissertations and projects, and we're going to give one view of how to go about delivering a dissertation or project. But to start, it's an important skill that students should have. It shows the student's ability to work independently, and that is good on a CV, on a curriculum vitae. It shows independence, and employers like that. And also, in moving on through education onto more advanced courses, being able to demonstrate independent work, independent thinking, is an important skill. So overall, the opportunity to develop a dissertation or a project, an independent project, is useful. That opportunity is useful because it promotes the student. Now, having said that, supervisors and students have their own ideas about dissertations and designs, and therefore what will be said in this session may not entirely apply in all situations. Some supervisors will have other ways of going about it, which are quite legitimate and quite correct. It depends on the supervisor's interest, it depends on the supervisor's approach to this type of work. So what we're trying to offer here is just one view and one insight into this whole area. So it's meant to clarify the stages in the process. It's not trying to suggest that this is the only way to attempt research work, particularly project work. But having said all of that, having given those disclaimers, let's move into to see what we recommend as an approach at the higher national diploma and undergraduate levels. So we'll start with a general view. So we'll start with, let's say, a title. Well, the title, it may change a little over the course of the project. It shouldn't do. Ideally, the title should stay the same over the course, but there may be some slippage in the title. It may mutate slightly, and that often happens to students. They start with one title, but by the time they get to the end, the title has changed slightly. But it shouldn't do. It should stay the same right throughout. A title is usually made up from two parts, and this is not often recognized by many students. But the two parts are a theory part and an application part. Usually titles have two parts to them. It just looks like a title when it's read out, but in fact, if you reflect on it for a few moments, you'll see that it is made up from two parts. Take an example of a title. Say, an analysis of the leadership style of Bill Gates during the period leading up to his retirement from Microsoft. Now, that's the title of the project, let's say. It's in the business area. This particular one could be in the HR, the human resource area. It's a project looking at the leadership style of Bill Gates leading up to the period of his retirement. Now it looks straightforward as a title, but in fact we can identify two parts here. We can divide a part on leadership styles. Now leadership styles, that's looking at the theory of leadership. And there are many theories of leadership in the business area. There are many theories of leadership that will be encountered by students working towards a qualification in business. And the second part will be Bill Gates. Well, more specifically, Bill Gates in the period leading up to his retirement. So we can identify here a theory part and, if you like, an application part. So the theory is, what the books suggest, looking at different styles of leadership, and then looking at what happened in practice in the context of Bill Gates, and seeing which style most suits that situation. So titles, by and large, are in two parts, worth noting. Secondly, we have the introduction to the project. Now, the introduction, well, this is an outline of the contents of the project. And it should happen at the start, because it's the introduction, it's the second point. But sometimes it's probably best to leave it to the end. It's not good practice to leave it to the end, because it's going about things backwards, but often, having written up the project, the introduction is easily done by looking at what is on the paper and talking about what will happen, because there is a good indication, there's a clear indication of what's on the paper, what's being completed. But it should be done at the start. It should be done as a second point. But by and large, probably a good idea to leave it towards the end. So the introduction provides the reader with a good overview of the project. If the reader doesn't want to read the whole project, just read the introduction, and the reader will get a good, clear picture of what's going to come up, what the project is about. Thirdly, the review of the literature. Now, the review of the literature is really, if you like, it's the theory. It's the theory relating to what's going to be tested, what's going to be looked at. The review of the literature it's a review of the sources that's going to appear. And amongst these will be the theory, the generalized material. In the context of the question we talked about earlier, the leadership styles of Bill Gates leading up to his retirement, the review of the literature will have a lot on different leadership styles, explaining the leadership styles and their advantages and disadvantages and their structure and so on. That's the theory. There may also be material in the literature review on Bill Gates and on Bill Gates's work at Microsoft in the period leading up to his retirement. That's quite legitimate. But we'll emphasize here the theory section just for the moment. And the theory leads to questions or hypotheses. If it's one, it's a hypothesis, I-S, H-Y-P-O-T-H-E-S-I-S. But it may be more than one, in which case it's hypotheses. Now, so we've got several theories and we have hypotheses. Hypotheses are just testable questions. And we collect data, and the data is used, analyzed and used to test the hypotheses. So the data will be collected by some survey method or some method of collection or some review of company literature or whatever it is, press statements or whatever. That data will be reviewed and it will be used to shed light on the hypothesis. So let's go over this again very slowly. The review of the literature will have a lot of theoretical background. It'll provide frameworks, theoretical frameworks for the analysis. But it'll also contain some practical information about, let's say, Bill Gates and Microsoft and the period leading up to Bill Gates' retirement and so on. So it'll have a lot of that information. But just to emphasize the theory part here, we'll talk about the questions, the hypotheses linked to the theory, and then the data which will be used to test the hypothesis. So, by and large, we'll see the review of the literature as the theory section. Now read over the theory of the topic you are proposing and produce a good discussion of its major points. So it's important that the student understands the literature, understands the theory that was indicated in the title. In our case here, leadership styles. So it's important that the student understands the literature on leadership styles. And also, as I said earlier, has got some handle or some grip on some of the practical sources of information related to, in this case, Bill Gates and his retirement from Microsoft. The review of the literature it's like an essay on some piece of theory. So it's not looking, in the example we've got here, it's not looking at leadership, it's looking at styles of leadership, that particular aspect of the literature on leadership. So it's like an essay on that. It could be an essay on the management of change or on innovation theory. It depends on the title of the question. The title we talked about was leadership styles. But it could be on whatever the title is. Whatever the title of the work is, so be it. There will be a review of the literature. Now next is methodology. Well, methodology is it's a study of method. What method does the project use? You need to state the method you intend to follow when researching your proposed topic. Students need to say what the method will be. They're going to use some research method, so it's got to be stated. It's going to be questionnaires, or it's going to be interviews, or it's going to be secondary data. It's going to be statistical modeling, or it's going to be some sort of method that will be used to analyze the data. So it could be participant observation, for example, or questionnaires, or interviews, or as I said, it could be statistical analysis. Now there are two parts here. First of all, the theory of the method you intend to follow. If you're going to look at interviews, what's the theory of interviews? What's an interview trying to do? It's trying to get information in an unbiased fashion. So what do you understand by bias? What's understood by piloting the questions in advance? If it's trying to work out attitudes of people, what are attitudinal scales? How are they worked out? So there is a sort of a theory to the methodology that needs to be explained. And then there is an application, discussion of the method as applied in the project. So the methodology applies the theory that's been worked out. So if it's going to use, as I said, interviews, then the background to interviews is explained, if you like, that's in the theory section, and then the application. The actual interviews were used to inquire into the topic under consideration in this particular dissertation. Next we have the data capture, or the empirical section. We say empirical. Empirical means done by experiment. Empiricism normally applies in the natural sciences, in physics, biology, chemistry and so on, where experiments can be done. But we use the word freely nowadays, and more or less it's accepted to be any practical piece of research. It's empirical. So data capture is getting the data. If it's a survey or let's say interviews, then the data must be captured. The questionnaire must be delivered, or the interviews must be set up. and conducted. That's data capture. Getting the information is data capture. This is the way that you collect the data and what you found. That's what's meant by data capture and the findings. It's the way you collected the data and what you actually found. It should include any problems that you have encountered and any criticisms of the procedures that you want to include. It should be open and honest. It's important that the work in this context is open. In other words, that if there was bias or there was a suspicion of bias, it's declared in the write-up. Don't leave it for the reader to criticize. The writer should do the criticism. That means that the reader will have more respect for the writer. Having got the data, having got the methodology, then it's possible to do an analysis. Putting the theory and the data together enables an analysis. To what extent does the data support the theory or reject the theory? To what extent does the data shed light on the, if you like, on the theory that was selected? This is the important chapter. This is very important, the analysis section. It links the review of the literature and the data together to form the analysis. The two parts come together here. Take an example. Every time the price of petrol increases, less petrol is sold. Now that's our hypothesis. And that's based on a literature, in this case from economics. Now you're testing the literature with the data that you've collected and simply using the company or the organization to supply the data. So you're testing the literature, and the company or the organization or the people that are stopped are simply supplying the data. So it's possible to look at the company or the respondents to a survey as sources of information, sources of data. And this data will be put against the theory when it's analyzed, when the data is analyzed, put against the theory, and it will suggest that the theory is good or acceptable or not good. It's rejectable. So the analysis is what brings the two parts together. The review of the literature plus the data capture, the empirical work. So the review of the literature plus the data capture is equal to the analysis. That's where the analysis comes from. So it's based on the previous chapter, the data capture, and it's based on the literature. The methodology tells us how the data was captured. So putting 3 and 5 together gives us the analysis. 3 plus 5 equals 6 in this case. So we have the review of the literature. That should be a bit higher up, that arrow. The data capture and the analysis. Then we come to the conclusions. Well, this is a summary of the analysis and rounds off the whole project. This is what concludes the project. It rounds the whole thing off. It's a snapshot of the project, and the reader should be able to understand the project from this chapter. It's, if you like, it's a summary of the whole exercise, the whole project. The conclusion comes directly from the analysis. Conclusions can't come from anywhere else. If the conclusions are statements that are not worked out in the analysis, then they are wrong. They are outside of the remit of the project. In legal terms, they will be classified as ultra vires. They're outside of the law. They're outside of what was required. The conclusions must come from the analysis, entirely from the analysis. So we've now got a very integrated picture of our project. It's also a bibliography, which is a list of sources used, and it should be in alphabetic order. Try to make it easy for the reader. It should be in alphabetic order: surname, forename, date of publication, title, publisher, place of publication. For example, Keynes, and the forenames would be John Maynard. The title, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. The date of publication, 1936. The publisher, Macmillan. And the place of publication, London. Journal entries in the bibliography, well, it's the same sort of arrangement: surname, forename, title, name of journal, date of publication, journal edition, and the page numbers. If it's a World Wide Web entry, it's the surname, forename, title, the web address, and the date it's accessed. Always put in the date it's accessed, because websites change sometimes. They're not accessible. If the reader wants to check it, it may not be available. So it's best to put the date in which the website was accessed. There is a point here that should be stressed, that the bibliography contains all of the sources used. Contains the sources that are used. Nothing else is needed, just the sources that are used. And they should be referenced throughout the work using the Harvard system of referencing. Now, these are the subject of separate videos which you should look at. The Harvard system of referencing is used, or should be used, right throughout the work, from the introduction onwards, onto the conclusion. Anywhere a source of information crops up in the project, it should be referenced using the Harvard system of referencing and the full title of the reference produced in the bibliography. As I said, there are separate videos on the Harvard system, so you should look at those. Lastly, we have appendices. Now, the appendices, well, they comprise of material that you wish to provide to the reader, but do not wish to be included in the word count or in the project overall assessment. It may be articles that you've found that the reader would find difficult to find. It may be clippings from newspapers or magazines, or clips of videos, or whatever. Material that the reader would find difficult to find. So the appendices, don't make the appendices too long, but just any material that was found and the reader would find it difficult to locate, perhaps put it into the appendix and reference it in the main body. Call it Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and so on. Now, I mentioned earlier about the Harvard system. Well, the style and presentation of the work should be based on the Harvard system. The standard of English used: make sure grammar is good, spelling's perfect, and pagination. Make sure that the pages are worked out properly and there's not pages starting halfway down the page and starting at the bottom of the page. Make sure the pages look right. So make sure the standard of English is correct. Take time with making sure that the write-up looks professional. Nowadays, word processing packages, desktop publishing packages, have got built-in spell checkers and grammar checkers and so on, and try to enable those and see what it's turning up. Also, read over it several times. Don't just write it up and submit it the next day. Write it up in plenty of time to go back over, read it again and again to see if it reads correctly. It's often the case when a work has been written up and left for a couple of days, go back and read it, you will find mistakes and you'll find errors in it. The nice thing about having it on computer file is it can be shifted around quite easily, and material may be added or subtracted as required. Make sure, above all, that the dissertation presentation requirements are adhered to. The submission date is honoured, and that the word limit, if there is one, is honoured as well. That if there is a 5,000 word limit, then there is no more than 5,000 words. It may not be precisely 5,000. Normally tutors give, say, 5,000 plus or minus 5% or 10% or whatever. Depends on the tutor, and clarification for that should be sought in advance. But honour it, and it's important to do that. And the last point is that always pick a research topic that's of interest to you. It's something that you have to work on your own, and if you're not interested, it's going to be very difficult. So pick a topic that is of interest to you, that matches your career aspirations, or that will be useful for you perhaps in the future, or just something that interests you, because you will be motivated and you'll find the work a lot easier as a consequence. Your dissertation or your project shows what you can do on your own, and that's very valuable. And at the end of it, you should be very proud of your work, and particularly if you do well and score good marks. Employers are interested to see what you do on your own, as I said at the start, and academics are also very interested to see if you can research on your own. It's a valuable skill. So what I've presented here is one view of how to go about doing a project or dissertation. Precise guidelines will be given to you by your tutor and by the requirements of the course you're on. This is the view that we've adopted in this situation, and hopefully will be of use to you. That's all I'm going to do in this session. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.